Ambassador Thiel Vask had served the Conclave of United Species for 30 years, but she had never once heard anyone speak about the exclusion sphere around the yellow star in the Orion Arm until the day she was appointed to the Antiquities Council. It was supposed to be a quiet position, a reward for decades of careful diplomacy among 12,000 spacefaring civilizations that stretched across the galaxy like a web of light and ambition and old grudges that nobody remembered the origins of anymore. On her very first morning, she sat in the crystal archive beneath the Conclave's central spire on the station world of Varanth, and she pulled up the oldest active directive in galactic law, not out of duty, but out of simple curiosity. And what she found made her blood run cold in a way that nothing in 30 years of alien politics ever had. The directive had no author that any living species could identify, and it predated the Conclave itself by at least 9,000 years, which meant it had been written by the Elder Confluence, a coalition of the galaxy's first civilizations that had risen and fallen and crumbled into dust long before most of the current species had even learned to use fire. The words were plain and ancient, and they carried a weight that pressed against her chest like a stone. That which sleeps on the third world must not be awakened. That which grows there must not be released. Thiel read those words 3 times, and then she closed the file and sat in silence for a long time. She was Korathai, tall and thin, with skin that shifted between pale blue and silver depending on her mood. And she had a mind that worked like a knife through water, always cutting toward the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. And right now, every instinct she had was screaming that she had just stumbled onto something enormous. Over the following weeks, she dug deeper, requesting access to archives that had not been opened in thousands of years, pulling data from storage crystals so old they had to be read with equipment borrowed from a museum. What she found was worse than the directive itself. The Elder Confluence had not simply quarantined the third planet of the Sol system. They had erased it from existence in every way that mattered, short of actually destroying it. Star maps from that era had been redrawn with Sol removed entirely, as if the star did not exist and had never existed. Cultural databases had been scrubbed clean of any reference to the system or its worlds. Scientific surveys that would have naturally cataloged the region had been redirected to skip over it entirely. And most disturbing of all, the species that had once lived nearest to Sol, 3 separate civilizations that had called the neighboring star systems home, had been quietly and gently relocated to the far side of the galaxy with their memories of their original homeworlds. Chemically suppressed. It was the most thorough and deliberate act of suppression in the entire recorded history of the galaxy, and it had been carried out with a precision and a patience that spoke of absolute terror. Someone, something, on that little blue world, orbiting that unremarkable yellow star, had frightened the most powerful civilizations the galaxy had ever known so badly that they had spent centuries making sure no one would ever go looking for it. Thiel brought her findings to the full Antiquities Council, and watched as 12 species worth of diplomats and scholars turned pale or dark or rigid with shock, depending on their biology. What could possibly justify this level of suppression? Asked Councillor Dren, a massive Bathorai, whose forearms were trembling in a way that his species only did when they were deeply afraid. That is exactly what concerns me, Thiel replied, and she told them the rest. The Sentinel stations, the automated weapons platforms that ringed the exclusion sphere in a shell of ancient and terrible firepower, were dying, and they had been dying for a long time. Their power cores were technology that no living species understood, built by the Elder Confluence using principles that had been deliberately destroyed, along with every other record of what they knew about Sol. And those cores were finally running out of energy after more than 12,000 years of continuous operation. Wanted to destroy the Sol system entirely, collapse the star, shatter the planets, reduce everything within the sphere to dust and radiation and silence. But Thiel argued for a third path, and she argued with every ounce of skill and passion she had earned in 30 years of standing between species that wanted to kill each other. "We are not the Elder Confluence," she told the council in a voice that rang through the chamber like a bell. "And we do not have the right to destroy what we do not understand, nor do we have the luxury of ignorance anymore, because the cage is breaking whether we want it to or not. And I would rather know what is inside it before the door opens on its own." The vote was close, terrifyingly close. But in the end, Thiel's argument carried the day by a margin of 2 votes, one of which was her own. The council authorized the construction and deployment of a single shielded reconnaissance probe, equipped with the most advanced sensors then. Conclave could build, designed to cross the exclusion sphere boundary and report back what it found inside. Thiel stood in the command center on Verith and watched the probe's telemetry as it slipped through a gap in the failing Sentinel network and crossed into the forbidden space around Sol. The first readings came back almost immediately, and they made no sense at all. The probe detected massive electromagnetic radiation saturating local space. Not natural radiation from the star, but structured signals, organized and layered and complex beyond anything a dead or primitive world should produce. Then the probe turned its sensors toward the third planet, and the readings that came back made every scientist in the command center stop breathing. There were cities down there, vast sprawling cities that covered entire coastlines and river valleys and mountain ranges, glowing with artificial light that was visible from orbit. There were artificial satellites in orbit around the planet, thousands of them, and there were structures on the surface of the planet's single large moon. There were ships, actual spacecraft, moving between the third and fourth planets. And there were life signs, not thousands, not millions, but billions of individual sentient beings, living and working and building on a world that the entire galaxy had believed was either dead or sleeping for 12,000 years. Thiel gripped the edge of the console so hard that her silver skin turned white, and she whispered a single word that carried all the weight of everything that was about to change. Impossible. Whatever the Elder Confluence had locked away in this forgotten corner of the galaxy was not asleep, and it was not dead, and it had not been waiting quietly in the dark. It had been building. The probe's data reached a full conclave within hours, and what followed was the closest thing to mass panic that 12,000 civilizations had ever experienced at the same time. Emergency sessions were called on every council world, from the core systems to the outer rim, and species that had not spoken to each other in centuries suddenly found themselves united by a single overwhelming question. What in the name of every god and equation and natural law had been growing inside the exclusion sphere all this time? The conclave authorized an expedition within a week, which was faster than they had ever authorized anything in their entire history. And that speed alone told Thiel just how frightened they truly were. 5 ships were chosen, the best the conclave had, armed with the most powerful weapons and shielded with the most advanced defenses, crewed by representatives of 15 different species, each one selected for a specific expertise that might be needed when they arrived. Thiel was appointed chief envoy because she was the one who had opened this door, and because nobody else wanted the job. Commander Rethis Hal of the Venari was appointed military commander of the expedition, a decision that made Thiel uneasy, because the Venari were known throughout the galaxy not for their diplomacy, but for their ability to calculate exactly how to destroy things in the most efficient way possible. Rethis was tall even by Venari standards, with dark armored skin and 4 eyes that never seemed to blink, and he moved through the flagship like a weapon that had not yet decided where to point itself. The fleet crossed into the exclusion sphere on the 43rd day after the probe's discovery. And from the moment they entered Sol's territory, the crew began to understand why the Elder Confluence had been so afraid. The noise hit them first. Human civilization was loud in a way that no other species in the galaxy had ever been. Radio waves and television broadcasts and digital signals and satellite communications all layered on top of each other in a wall of electromagnetic chaos that made the fleet's communication officers wince and reach for their filters. They intercepted and decoded the signals over the course of several days, and what they found inside them was more disturbing than any weapon could have been. They found a species that had fought thousands of wars against itself, wars of territory and religion and ideology and resources and pride, and sometimes for reasons that seemed to make no sense at all. They found a species that had developed weapons capable of destroying its own world, nuclear devices that could crack open cities like eggs, and had actually used them on each other, and then had somehow pulled back from the edge and kept going. They found a species that had nearly killed its own biosphere through pollution and carelessness and greed, and had then recognized what it was doing and begun the slow, painful work of fixing it. And they found a species that had done all of this completely alone, with no galactic knowledge, no alien technology, no guidance from older and wiser civilizations. A species that had clawed its way from mud and stone to nuclear power and space travel and thinking machines in what amounted to an evolutionary heartbeat. Rethis Hal ran threat projections in his quarters every night after reviewing the day's intelligence, feeding data into military models that the Venari had spent 10,000 years perfecting. And every single simulation ended the same way. If humanity was given access to galactic technology and galactic knowledge, they would match the Conclave's most advanced species within 2 centuries and surpass them within 5. Their rate of innovation was not just fast, it was impossible by every model the galaxy had ever built, as if something was driving them forward with a force. That had nothing to do with logic or necessity. Rethis did not sleep well after that. The expedition made first contact on the 51st day at the very edge of the Sol system, where a human deep space survey vessel called the ISV Magellan was conducting routine scans of the outer planets. The Magellan was small by galactic standards, barely 100 meters long, powered by a fusion drive that any Conclave engineer would have called primitive. But it was real, and it was functional, and it was crewed by beings who had built it with nothing but their own hands and minds. Captain Lena Ortega commanded the Magellan, and when the Conclave fleet appeared on her sensors, she did something that stunned every alien watching. She did not run, and she did not fire, and she did not panic. She powered down her weapons, opened a broad-spectrum communication channel, and said in a voice that was calm and steady and carried just the faintest edge of wonder, "Captain Lena Ortega, of the interstellar survey vessel Magellan, representing the United Earth Federation. We have been waiting for this moment for a very long time, and we welcome you to our home." Thiel listened to those words and felt something she could not name move through her chest. The aliens boarded the Magellan at Ortega's invitation, and Thiel walked through the corridors of the small human ship, surrounded by beings she had never seen before in her life, and everything about them was strange and contradictory and impossible. They were small, shorter than most galactic species, with soft skin and fragile bones and no natural armor, or venom or electromagnetic defenses of any kind. And by every biological measure, they should have been prey animals on whatever world had produced them. But they moved with a confidence that had nothing to do with physical strength, and they looked at the alien delegation not with fear or submission, but with open, burning curiosity, as if the arrival of extraterrestrial life was not a crisis, but an opportunity. Captain Ortega shook Thiel's hand, a human gesture of greeting that involved pressing flesh against flesh in a way that made several of the alien delegates visibly uncomfortable, and smiled. And Thiel noticed that the expression involved baring teeth, which on most worlds was a threat display, but which humans apparently used to communicate warmth and welcome. They were a species of contradictions wrapped in contradictions, and Thiel was beginning to understand why the Elder Confluence had not known what to do with them. But it was what Thiel's instruments detected that truly unsettled her. Every human on the ship was radiating something, a faint energy signature that her equipment could barely register, hovering at the very edge of detection, like a sound just below the threshold of hearing. It was not heat, and it was not electromagnetic, and it did not match any known biological process in the galactic database, and yet it was there, pulsing gently from every man and woman aboard the Magellan like a second heartbeat made of light. And every alien in the room could feel it, without instruments. A subtle pressure, a warmth, a sense of standing too close to something vast and deep and powerful that was only barely contained. Thiel said nothing about it to the humans, because she did not yet know what it meant. But Rethis Hal knew enough to be afraid, and that night he sent a classified transmission back to the Conclave on a channel that even Thiel could not access. And his message was simple and devastating. The humans are not simply an advanced species. They are an impossible species. Their biology contains something that does not occur naturally anywhere else in the known galaxy. The Elder Confluence did not quarantine Earth to protect the galaxy from what humans might do. They quarantined it because of what humans are. Recommend extreme caution. I recommend we find out what we are truly dealing with before we open any more doors. The message reached the Conclave, and the Conclave read it, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the most powerful governing body in the galaxy had absolutely no idea what to do next. While Thiel walked among the humans on their noisy, crowded, beautiful, impossible world, a team of Conclave archaeologists on the far side of the galaxy was cutting through the last door of a vault that had been sealed for longer than most stars had been burning. The vault was buried in the core of a dead world called Sethin Null, a planet that had once been the seat of the Elder Confluence's central government and was now nothing but cold rock and silence, orbiting a dying red star that nobody visited anymore. The archaeologists had been working for months, cutting through layer after layer of material that their tools could barely scratch. And when the final seal broke, and the door swung inward on hinges that had not moved in 12,000 years, the air that rushed out was so old, it tasted like dust and time itself. But Thiel did not know about the vault yet. She was standing on Earth, and Earth was overwhelming her in ways she had not been prepared for. Planet was alive in a way that no other world she had ever visited was alive. She had been to garden worlds and ocean worlds, and worlds covered in forests that stretched from pole to pole. But Earth was something different, something aggressive in its vitality, as if life here did not simply exist, but fought and clawed and demanded its right to keep existing with a fury that bordered on madness. There were millions of species packed onto a single world, plants and animals and insects and microorganisms tangled together in ecosystems so complex that galactic biologists had given up trying to model them after the first week. The weather alone was violent enough to kill. Storms that tore across continents, earthquakes that shattered cities, volcanoes that buried entire regions in fire and ash. And yet life on Earth had not retreated from any of it, but had instead adapted and endured and come back stronger every single time. Galactic science held that intelligent life emerged on quiet, stable worlds, where conditions were predictable and resources were abundant, and evolution could proceed at a gentle, measured pace. Earth was the opposite of that, in every possible way. And yet here were the humans, not just surviving, but thriving, building, dreaming, reaching for the stars with hands that should have been too fragile and minds that should have been too young. Thiel visited their cities and was staggered by the density and energy of them. Millions of humans packed together in towers of glass and steel, moving through streets that hummed with noise and light and purpose at every hour of every day. She visited their universities and found scholars who had mapped the structure of reality at the subatomic level, who had decoded the language of their own genes, who had built machines that could think and learn and create, all without any knowledge that the galaxy existed beyond their own small system. She visited their museums, and their monuments, and their battlefields, and she saw the full truth of what humanity was, a species defined by contradiction, capable of creating beauty that made her weep, and committing horrors that made her sick, building civilizations that spanned continents, and then burning them down, and building again on the ashes. They were everything the galaxy was not, messy and loud and violent, and passionate and stubborn and creative and terrifying. And she was beginning to understand why the Elder Confluence had not simply feared them, but had feared what they represented. Then the message came from Sethan Null, and everything changed. The archaeologists had opened the vault, and inside they had found the truth. Not fragments or hints or coded warnings, but the actual truth, recorded in crystal matrices that played back the voices and images of beings who had been dead for 12,000 years. The Elder Confluence had been the first civilizations to touch the stars, and they had believed that this made them the custodians of all life in the galaxy, wise and ancient, and responsible for everything that grew under their watch. And then they had found Earth. The records showed what they had discovered, and Thiel sat in a small room in a human hotel in a city called Geneva, and watched the playback on a screen that trembled in her hands, and felt the foundations of everything she believed about the universe crack and shift beneath her. Billions of years ago, before the first stars had cooled, before the first planets had formed, before life of any kind had existed anywhere, the universe had contained a single primordial force. The Elder Confluence called it the breath, though they admitted that no word in any language could truly capture what it was. It was raw creative energy, chaotic and alive, and burning with a potential that was almost infinite. And it was the engine that had driven dead matter to become living matter, that had pushed simple chemistry to become biology, that had sparked the first cells to divide and grow and reach toward complexity. It was the force that made the universe want to be alive. As the universe aged and expanded, this energy had dissipated, spreading thinner and thinner across the vastness of space, until it was barely detectable anywhere, a faint background hum that most civilizations never even noticed. But in one place it had not dissipated. Earth's biosphere, through some accident of cosmic geography that even the Elder Confluence could not fully explain, had become a natural reservoir for the breath, a well where the primordial energy pooled and concentrated and fed into every living thing that grew there. This was why Earth's biosphere was so violent and so resilient and so impossibly diverse. It was saturated with the raw creative force of the universe itself, and every organism on the planet carried a trace of it in their cells. But humans were different from every other species on Earth in one critical way. Through some accident of evolution, some random mutation that had occurred in an ancestor species millions of years ago, humans had become not just passive carriers of the breath, but active conduits. The energy flowed through them in ways it did not flow through any other living thing, and it responded to their emotions and their will and their deepest, most fundamental need to survive and create and become more than what they were. This was why human willpower could override logic and reason and even basic biology. Why humans could push through pain and exhaustion and fear that would stop any other species dead. Why they could believe in things that did not exist and then make those things real through sheer force of determination. This was why they innovated faster than any model could predict, why they adapted to every environment they encountered. Catastrophes that should have ended them 100 times over. The breath was not a metaphor, and it was not a mystery. It was a measurable force, and it was growing stronger in humanity with every generation, as their minds became more complex and their capacity for conscious thought expanded. The Elder Confluence had discovered all of this, and they had been terrified beyond anything they had ever experienced. They had seen what the breath could do when it was consciously wielded. It could reshape matter at the molecular level. It could rewrite the fundamental forces of physics. It could ignite stars or extinguish them. It could create life from nothing or unmake it with a thought. If humanity ever awakened to what they truly were, if they ever learned to consciously channel the force that burned inside them, they would become something the galaxy had no word for. Something between gods and forces of nature, capable of reshaping reality itself. Confluence had debated for centuries what to do, and in the end, they could not bring themselves to destroy an innocent species that had done nothing wrong, that did not even know what it carried. So they chose quarantine, seal them away behind walls of power and silence, erase every trace of them from galactic memory, and pray that in the darkness of isolation, they would never discover the fire that lived inside them. Thiel finished watching the records and sat very still for a very long time. Then her communicator chimed, and one of her aides told her to come quickly to a hospital in the city, because something had happened that she needed to see. She arrived at a children's hospital 20 minutes later, and found a room full of human doctors standing in stunned silence around the bed of a small girl who was no more than 7 years old. The child had been in an accident 3 days ago, struck by a vehicle, massive brain trauma, declared clinically dead by every scan and every instrument the humans had. And then 10 minutes ago, every neuron in the girl's brain had reignited at once, not slowly, not gradually, but all at once, like a light being switched on, and the child had opened her eyes and looked around the room and asked for her mother. Thiel's instruments screamed with readings that went far beyond anything she had measured before. The energy signature that every human carried was blazing from this small girl like a bonfire, so bright and so strong that Thiel could feel it in her own bones. She looked at the child, and the child looked back at her with dark, curious eyes that held no fear at all, and Thiel felt a cold, ancient dread settle into her heart. The awakening that the Elder Confluence had feared was not some distant future event that might or might not come to pass. It was happening right now, in a hospital room in Geneva, in the bright, wondering eyes of a 7-year-old girl who had just come back from the dead. The vault's contents were supposed to be classified at the highest possible level, restricted to the Antiquities Council and the Conclave's senior leadership, locked behind codes that would take 1,000 years to break. They leaked within 9 days. Thiel never found out who was responsible, though she suspected it was someone who believed the galaxy had a right to know what it had been hiding from for 12,000 years. And in a way she could not entirely disagree with that reasoning, even though the consequences were catastrophic. 12,000 civilizations learned the truth about humanity in the span of a single galactic news cycle, and the reaction was exactly what Thiel had feared it would be. Panic. Deep and primal and species-wide panic that rippled across the galaxy like a shockwave from an exploding star. The Conclave fractured almost immediately into 3 factions that formed along lines of fear and ambition and principle. Watched it happen from Earth, with a growing sense of dread that sat in her stomach like a stone. The first faction called themselves the Preservers, and Thiel led them because nobody else would. The Preservers argued that humanity had committed no crime, that they had not chosen to carry the breath, any more than any species chose the color of its blood, and that the galaxy had no moral right to punish or destroy a civilization for the sin of existing. They were the smallest faction by far. The second faction were the Sterilists, a coalition of elder species led by the Bathory and the Kelesh, and a dozen other civilizations old enough to remember their own legends about the Elder Confluence, and terrified enough to believe that the Confluence had been right all along. The Sterilists argued that the only safe course of action was the one the Elder Confluence had been too sentimental to take: the complete and total destruction of Earth and every living thing on it, before humanity fully awakened to what they were and became something the galaxy could never contain or control. They spoke of it in calm, measured tones, as if they were discussing the removal of a tumor rather than the extermination of 8 billion sentient beings. And Thiel hated them for that calmness, more than she would have hated them for anger. The third faction was in many ways the most dangerous of all. The Harvesters were led by Dominarch Keth Vorin of the Scythal hegemony, a species of sleek predatory beings with mirror-bright scales and minds that thought in terms of power and advantage and nothing else. Keth Vorin did not want to destroy humanity. He wanted to harvest them. He wanted to capture humans by the millions and extract the breath from their bodies and channel it into Scythal technology, believing that this would make his species the supreme power in the galaxy for the rest of time. He spoke about it openly and without shame. If the enslavement and vivisection of an entire sentient species was simply good strategy, and Thiel hated him even more than she hated the Sterilists, because at least the Sterilists were motivated by fear rather than greed. The Conclave's debates grew louder and angrier with each passing day, and Thiel fought with everything she had, arguing and persuading and pleading and refusing to give ground, even when it felt like the entire galaxy was pressing down on her. But while the aliens argued about their fate, the humans learned the truth as well. Thiel never discovered exactly how. Human intelligence agencies were remarkably good at intercepting alien communications, a fact that surprised no one who had studied how often humans had spied on each other throughout their own history. But within weeks of the vault's contents leaking to the Conclave, the United Earth Federation's leadership had a complete translation of the Elder Confluence's records. Rage, and she expected fear, and she saw both of those things. But what she did not expect was the third thing that moved through humanity like a wave when they learned what they carried inside them: recognition. Humans had always known, not consciously, not scientifically, but in the deep wordless way that they knew things through stories and myths and dreams and the strange certainty that lived in their bones. Every human culture in history had spoken of it: a divine spark, an inner fire, a soul, a light that separated the living from the dead and the possible from the impossible. Their religions had built entire cosmologies around it. Their philosophers had spent millennia trying to name it. Their artists had dedicated their lives to expressing it. And their scientists had always suspected that there was something about human consciousness that their instruments were not quite able to measure. They had been right all along. Rightness did not break them. It galvanized them. Captain Lena Ortega emerged as a voice for humanity during this time, not because she was chosen or appointed, but because she was the first human the aliens had met, and because she had a way of speaking that cut through noise and fear and reached something fundamental. The Conclave granted her a communication link, expecting pleas or threats or desperate bargaining from a species that had just learned the entire galaxy was debating whether to exterminate them. Instead, Ortega stood on the bridge of the Magellan with her hands clasped behind her back and her dark eyes steady, and she said words that would be remembered for as long as the galaxy had memory. You locked us in a room for 12,000 years, and we built a civilization anyway. We split the atom, and walked on our moon and mapped our own genome, and taught sand to think. We cured diseases that killed millions of us, and we invented music that makes us. weep with joy, and we looked up at stars we could not reach, and we refused to stop reaching. We did all of this blind and alone and afraid. So before you decide what to do with us, I want you to imagine something. Imagine what we will do now that we can see. The conclave received her words in silence, and Thiel watched the faces of 12,000 species as they processed what Ortega had said. And she saw fear on many of those faces, but she also saw something else on some of them, something that looked like awe. But it was not enough. The Sterilists had been building a fleet in secret for weeks, pulling warships from a dozen species into a combined armada that was larger than anything the galaxy had assembled since the last Great War 3,000 years ago, and on the 62nd day after first contact, they made their move. The armada launched towards Sol, 400 warships carrying enough firepower to crack a world open and burn everything on its surface to ash. And they were not the only ones moving. Kethvoran and the Scythal hegemony had mobilized their own fleet, smaller but faster, and equipped with experimental technology designed to capture and contain biological energy on a massive scale. And they raced towards Sol on a parallel course, intending to reach Earth before the Sterilists could destroy what Voran considered the most valuable resource in the universe. The galaxy was tearing itself apart over a single small world, and the people who lived on it, and Thiel could do nothing but watch from Earth as the storm gathered. Until she received a final transmission from the archaeological team on Sethin Null. They had found one more record in the vault, hidden behind a secondary seal, stored separately from everything else, marked with a symbol that the Elder Confluence had used only once in their entire history. The symbol meant, for them. It was a message, not for the galaxy, not for they, Conclave, not for whatever civilization might eventually open the vault, but for humanity. The Elder Confluence had written a message for the humans, to be delivered when the quarantine finally failed, and the truth finally came out. And they had trusted that someone, someday, would care enough to bring it to them. Thiel read the message, and felt tears run down her silver skin for the first time in her adult life. She commandeered the fastest ship in the expedition fleet, and she launched from Earth's surface, with the message stored in a crystal against her chest, and she aimed for the edge of the Sol system, where the Sterilist armada was about to arrive. She did not know if she would make it in time. She did not know if the message would matter. But she knew that she was going to try, because that was what the humans would do, and she had been among them long enough to catch the fire. Behind her on the surface of Earth, 8 billion humans looked up. At a sky full of stars they had only just begun to reach, and in the blood and bone of every single one of them, something old and vast and powerful stirred like a sleeper hearing its name called for the first time. The breath was waking up, and it was waking up in all of them at once. The Sterilist armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system, like a wall of iron and fire, 400 warships arranged in a killing formation that had not been used in 3,000 years, their weapons already charging with the kind of energy that could turn a planet's surface to glass. Admiral Kesoth of the Bathorai stood on the bridge of the flagship and looked at the distant blue dot that was Earth, and felt nothing but cold duty in his 4 hearts. He had not come here to be cruel, and he had not come here to enjoy what he was about to do. He had come because he believed with absolute certainty that if humanity was allowed to fully awaken, then everything else in the galaxy would eventually cease to matter. He gave the order to fire. The armada unleashed everything it had in a single coordinated barrage. Relativistic kill vehicles accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light. Antimatter warheads carrying enough energy to crack a continent apart. Gravity bombs designed to tear holes in the fabric of space itself. The barrage was so massive, that it lit up the solar system like a second sun, and every sensor on every human ship and station and satellite detected it at the same time. On Earth, the warning reached every screen and every speaker and every device simultaneously. A calm, automated voice, informing 8 billion people that objects moving at nearly the speed of light were inbound, and that impact with the planet's surface would occur in approximately 11 minutes, and that there was no defense and no evacuation possible. 11 minutes to live. File was still racing inbound in her stolen ship, the Elder Confluence's message burning against her chest, and she screamed into her communicator for someone to listen to her. But the frequencies were choked with noise and terror, and the silence of people who had run out of words. On the bridge of the Magellan, position near Mars, Captain Lena Ortega watched the barrage approach on her tactical display and did the math in her head, and knew with perfect clarity that nothing in humanity's arsenal could stop it. She closed her eyes, and on Earth, 8 billion people closed their eyes too, not in surrender, but in something that had no name in any language, a collective inward turning that happened without plan or coordination or conscious thought. Mothers held their children and thought about how much they loved them. Fathers stood in doorways and refused to look away from the sky. Soldiers put down their weapons and reached for the hands of the people beside them. Strangers on crowded streets turned to each other and said things they had never said before. And in hospitals and homes and schools and offices across every continent, the human species faced its death together. And in the bone and blood and brain of every single one of them, the breath answered. Not answer one mind at a time. It answered all of them at once. 8 billion voices calling out in a chorus that was not sound, but something older and deeper and more powerful than sound had ever been. The energy that the Elder Confluence had feared for 12,000 years rose through humanity like a tide. Not cold and not violent, but warm. Warm like sunlight on skin. Warm like the first breath of a newborn. Warm like the core of a star that burns not to destroy, but to give light. The warheads did not reach the surface. They stopped. 400 relativistic kill vehicles and antimatter warheads and gravity bombs hung suspended in the upper atmosphere of Earth, as if the air itself had decided to hold them, frozen in place by a force that every instrument on every ship in the system registered, but none could explain. And then they came apart, not in explosions, but in silence, dissolving like ice in warm water, their terrible energy unraveling into harmless golden light that drifted down through the atmosphere like snow. On the Sterilist flagship, Admiral Kessoth watched his entire barrage simply cease to exist, and for the first time in his long military career, he had no idea what to do next. The Sci-Fi Harvester fleet arrived moments later. 200 ships bristling with experimental technology, massive field generators designed to lock on to biological energy signatures and drain them like pumps draining a well. Dominarch Kesvoron ordered the generators activated, and they reached toward Earth with invisible hands made of force and mathematics, trying to grab the breath and pull it out of the humans who carried it. It did not work. The generators found the energy. It was everywhere, blazing from the planet like heat from a star, but they could not separate it from the humans, because it was not something the humans possessed. It was something they were, sitting inside human bodies, waiting to be extracted. It was woven into every cell and every thought and every heartbeat, inseparable from the consciousness that carried it. And trying to pull it out was like trying to separate water from wet or light from bright. The generators overloaded and burned out one by one, and Keth Vorun stood on his bridge and stared at the readings and understood for the first time that he had been wrong about everything. The breath was not a commodity, and it never would be. Thiel's ship burst through the chaos of the two fleets, and she opened every communication channel she could reach, and she broadcast the Elder Confluence's message on every frequency to every ship and every planet and every station that could hear her. The message played across the galaxy in the ancient voices of beings who had been dead for 12,000 years, and this is what it said. To the children of the third world, we are sorry. We were the first to touch the stars, and we believed that made us wise. When we found you small and new, and burning with the light we had lost, we were afraid. We chose to cage you, rather than trust you. We chose fear over faith. If you are hearing this, then our cages have failed, and you have grown beyond our power to contain. We do not ask forgiveness. We ask only this: be better than we were. The fire in you is the fire that lit the first stars. It is not a weapon. It is a gift. Use it not to rule, but to create. Not to destroy, but to mend. The universe is old and growing cold. You are its second chance. The words echoed through the Sol system and through the Conclave's relay network, and across every world that had a receiver capable of picking them up. And on Earth, 8 billion humans heard the message of the beings who had locked them away in the dark for 12,000 years, and they made their choice. They did not destroy the fleets. The breath, the spark, the fire that had lit the first stars radiated outward from Earth in a wave that moved faster than light itself. And it was not a weapon, and it was not an attack. It was warmth. Every alien in the Sol system felt it pass through them. Sterilist soldiers and harvester engineers, and terrified diplomats, and cold-eyed admirals, and what they felt was not pain, and not coercion, but connection. A sudden, overwhelming awareness of being alive, and being part of something vast and beautiful and shared. They felt what humans felt every day, without knowing it was extraordinary. The raw, unfiltered experience of existing in a universe that was alive, and that wanted them to be alive too. Weapons powered down across both fleets, not because anyone gave the order, but because the hands holding the controls suddenly could not remember why they had ever wanted to fire them. Soldiers wept. Beings who had never cried in their lives felt tears, or the equivalent of tears running down faces made of chitin and scale and stone. On the Sithal flagship, Keth Vorin sat down slowly in his command chair, and pressed his mirror-bright hands against his face, and felt something that he had no name for, because he had never experienced it before. A feeling that the universe was not a competition to be won, but a gift to be shared. On the Sterilist flagship, Admiral Kesoth lowered his 4 arms and stared at the blue world he had tried to burn, and whispered a word in his own language that meant both forgive and thank you. Captain Ortega stood on the bridge of the Magellan and watched every hostile ship in the system go still and quiet. And she opened a channel that reached every vessel, alien and human alike, and she spoke in a voice that was thick with emotion, but steady as stone. We did not ask for this fire, but it is ours, and we are not afraid of it. We have spent 12,000 years learning to carry it alone. Now, let us show you what it can do when we carry it together. 100 years passed. The galaxy became something that no one, human or alien, would have recognized. Humanity did not conquer it, because conquest was the smallest and least interesting thing they could have done with what they were. They healed it. Dying stars that had been fading for millions of years burned bright again, reignited by human hands that reached into their cores and fed them the breath the way a parent feeds a child. Barren worlds that had been dead rock and ice for longer than most civilizations had existed bloomed with new life. Forests and oceans and ecosystems that sprang up in decades rather than millions of years, driven by the creative force that humans carried with them wherever they went. Ancient diseases that had plagued alien species for millennia were cured, not by human medicine, but by human touch. The breath flowing from human hands into alien bodies and rewriting what was broken. Species that had stagnated for millions of years that had stopped evolving and stopped creating and stopped dreaming, felt something stir inside them again, as the breath spread through the galaxy like warmth through a cold room. Humans walked among the stars, not as conquerors or rulers, but as gardeners and builders and dreamers who could not look at a broken thing without wanting to fix it, and could not see an empty place without imagining what might grow there. The conclave still existed, but Earth sat at its center now, and above the great chamber where 12,000 species debated and argued and planned, a new creed was carved into stone that would endure for as long as civilization itself. The fire does not burn, the fire builds. Thiel Vask was old now, old by Korathai standards, her silver skin gone pale and thin, her movements slow in the way that time makes everything slow eventually. Alive, and she was standing on a world that had been dead rock 10 years ago, and was now covered in green growing things that reached toward a sun they had no right to be reaching toward. She stood on a balcony overlooking a valley full of flowers that had not existed a decade ago, and beside her stood a human child, a girl of maybe 6 or 7, one of the first generation born after the awakening, a child who had never known a time when humanity did not know what it truly was. The child's eyes were bright and dark and full of a light that Thiel could see without instruments now, because after 100 years among humans, even alien eyes had learned to see the breath. The girl looked up at the sky, where the stars were coming out one by one, and she reached up with one small hand as if she could touch them, and she turned to Thiel with a smile that held no fear and no arrogance and no cruelty, only wonder, pure and bottomless, and as old as the universe itself. "What is out there?" the child asked. Thiel looked down at the girl and then up at the stars, and she smiled with a mouth that had learned the expression from humans, and she answered with words that she meant with every atom of her being. "Everything, and it has been waiting for you."